Yes, I was sort of an early ham, right? Looking to find a proper refrigerator. On Saturday afternoons, there were those metropolitan broadcasts. And my father was very much an opera person. And he had memories of this one and that one. And his favorite opera was Norma, which I don't even remember at the time whether they ever broadcast that one. But every Saturday, I pretty well listened to the opera, imagining what was going on. And the voices were quite wonderful. I remember, I said, who was that? I got to know the names. That's how I began to have a real taste for it. The truth of the matter is I discovered, first of all, what the prices were down there, and I said, wow. And I did for a while buy tickets, and then I heard through the grapevine, but I've forgotten what the grapevine consisted of, about the claque. And that if you were willing to go inside and applaud on cue for certain people, you would get a free ticket to see the show. So I said, hey, here I am. And this very dapper gent would appear. We would all be standing outside about half an hour before the show. And he'd give out the tickets. He looked like sort of a bookie, but anything to do with the opera. But anyway, we went in, stood on the standing room on the side then, and when we had cues, when to applaud for so-and-so and so. So it's always wonderful to see them taking a bow, and then they would look a little bit in our direction. That meant keep it up. I'm not kidding. But there was one thing that I never would do, and that is I would never boo. And some were paying to have not themselves booed, but other people booed. I mean, the contention was incredible. It was almost, childish in a way. But there it was. One of the singers I really thought was marvelous was Lawrence Tibbett. And his voice was beginning to go then. But I had already heard recordings, so I knew what he sounded like. but I was very impressed by the fact that his acting on stage always had a kind of marvelous eloquence and sometimes a kind of savage poetry about it. And I said, isn't that marvelous? If only he could blend the two together. And it's coming late for him, but he can still act. And it was very strange that a couple of years later, I was asked to do one of my first sort of Broadway shows, and it was a revival of Peter Pan, the musical. And they needed a Captain Hook. We had the then movie star Veronica Lake playing Peter Pan. She was very good. But who did they bring up? Lawrence Tibbett. So we went after Lawrence Tibbett, and he didn't want to have any part of it, but he finally agreed to do it after we had gone and spoken to a very truculent Leonard Bernstein and sort of outside of Boston about any of the songs being changed in any way for Captain Hook. I had had a little experience with Tibbett before that, doing a revival of Rain, in which he played the Reverend Davidson, but he had nothing to sing in that. So they, of course, forced him to sing some old ritual gospel song or something, which he did reluctantly, and in a decent enough voice so that when we finally got to the musical, he was taking it on very well. He was very funny in it and very good. Because I never associated that kind of acting with opera singing. The opera singing I saw was very often not far from what's his name, the great English critic, the turn of the century, Newman, would say that don't expect much in opera. if the soprano raises her right hand, that means something's afoot. But if she raises two hands, you know there's a disaster coming. I love that. So the acting was perfunctory. I never saw anyone quite accept him on the stage. It had a kind of a magnetic quality about it. It was actually Julius Riddell who invited me to, among other young directors on and off Broadway, to direct an opera. So I said, oh, wow. By that time, I was connected with the Actors Studio. I was a student there, and I thought, well, is it possible to bring that kind of work into opera? So I shall see. And it worked out very well because the first opera I did was Susanna. It was in English. And although the people had already done a production of it, they were reviving it in a new production, and they were wonderful. They responded naturally. There was only one guy who gave me a hard time at the time. That was Norman Treadle. He would not change a thing. I wanted him to wear a seersucker suit, I remember when he first came in, so that he wasn't always, Mephistopheles. But later, and I got, by the way, a very good actor, and Phyllis Curtin was in it, and the people all responded. They were all American, and they responded with wonderful. I said, my God, these people are good, and it makes all the difference in the world. And I then became very excited about the possibility of opera. Indeed, that production was so successful, it went to Edinburgh and made a sort of a small name for itself, and it gave me an opportunity to finally meet Carlisle Floyd, one of the loves of my life in opera. She had played this, by the way, now in two different productions, and I was asking her now to completely change her venue. Now, it was at that time that Norman refused to wear, as I said, the seersucker suit or have anything to do. But I asked her, for instance, in her aria, her first big aria, to go on the roof of the house and look over the whole countryside. And she didn't even bat an eye. And the guy playing Little Bat, I said, Jesus, you're going to sing up there? And she said, yes, I'm going to sing up there. And she just did everything just automatically. There wasn't, and with her own kind of subtle power, So it was a very quiet, very easy kind of rapport. Never. Because, as a matter of fact, later on, I said, never again. I was asked to do it with very famous people, and I said, no, I know what they will do. I had an experience, and a friend of mine had a wonderful experience with an attempt to also bring, there were a lot of very good directors who came into the field then, and were invited to do these good old war horses. And I never forget his description of what happened. He went over to a particular star, what was her name, Zinka Milanov, who was a great singer, but not much of an actress. And he went on and on describing what Santuzza was going to do in Cavalleria, and she listened, She said, good. You tell them over there, I'll sing. So there it goes. But I avoided those kind of, because you cannot break those kind of habits like that. I discovered how difficult it is, and that's why the New York City Opera provided a marvelous school. They were very young people, and they were mostly American. And somehow the energy was both vibrant and open to putting on performances that had a sense of immediacy. And that's why I chose to keep on doing that. I did work later on with certain, you know, people from the Metropolitan and other places in the world, but they were unusual occasions. I was fortunate to meet with unusual people like Marilyn Horn. I was asked to do other revivals of works that didn't really interest me, you know. And I went back to the Actors Studio and I went back to Broadway, and I sort of left the opera behind me. But then about 10 years later, I had just finished directing the Broadway premiere of The Night of the Iguana by Williams. And I just felt at that time that there was something about Broadway that was beginning to lose all sense of itself as a place where fine place beside the usual musical and comedies were performed. And for some reason I said, I looked up, I remember reading in the paper and seeing a little advertisement saying the New York City Opera, Susanna, last performance, so-and-so. So I said, they'd been playing this all this time? Because they enumerated any number of performances. So I said, I've got to go up there and see this. So I went to the last performance, and it was as fresh as when I first did it. And I said, my God, that's terrific. So I called Julius. He said, where have you been, you know? I said, well, I've been around, but, you know, I've been on the other side of town. He said, well, listen, an opera just came, and I immediately thought of you, but I didn't know where to reach you. You weren't at the old number. I said, well, what is it? So he said, come, I want you to hear it. And it was Shostakovich's opera, then known as Katerina Izmailova. And we did the New York premiere of it. And from then on, I was so taken. I had also Eileen Schauler, who was a marvelous singing actress, and Richard Casserly, and people like that. And I said, by God, these people are terrific. And I just felt Broadway was on its way down the slope, both in every way, in terms of acting, in terms of writing, and all of that. And I was right. It gradually just lost itself. And I found a new home in opera. And it was a matter of the next year after the Katerina, I did The Fiery Angel, an opera which I was never able to really visualize properly. I did it at Spoleto in the second season with Lelia Gincher and Rolando Panerai and István Kertész, who didn't understand English, poor man, at the time, and I used to say terrible things to him and smile. Anyway, but I didn't find it. It was nicely sung, but the opera didn't work either there or when I did it in New York. There was something I didn't have, and that's when I, by sheer accident, got the Traviata in the move to Lincoln Center. I had not done a traditional opera up to that point. And he had essentially, you know, traditional operas. So he did not offer me the Traviata. He gave it to Robert Lewis. Robert Lewis had some awful argument with the set designer, and they split. And there was no director. So out of filling a void, Julius called me. He says, do you know Traviata? I said, yes, I know it. I know it. He says, well, listen. And he explained the story. I said, well, sure, who was singing it? So he mentioned people like Pat Brooks and Placido Domingo. And I said, oh, well, I don't know Pat Brooks. I know Placido. I'd seen. Well, I said, let me think about it. I thought about it for a couple of days, and ideas came to me. At the time, I had been going to the Actors Studio, and there was a young director named Walt Whitcover who put on a bit of Traviata, but very modern. because I'd never seen one of those in that shape. But of course, he had the frug. People fruging. I said, no, that doesn't work. But he suggested the fact that you could really make people out of these. You know, he had actors essentially who were singing. So I said, this opera can work as a piece of drama. So I said, it all depends on the woman. So I went back to Pat Brooks, and I met with her, and she was, you know, very sweet and all that. And so I said, would you do me a favor? Would you sing, you know, her aria when she's by herself, Estrano. So she did, and I said, would you try to do this with it? I gave her some ideas, and by God, she did it. And I said, wow, you know. And I said, my God, that's an indication. And I told Walt Whitcover about it. I said, you know, if you would really think about, if you want to go on with opera, the idea of doing it in modern terms, and this is like talking to myself, is a wonderful idea, but it depends, and this also reflects what I see now, depends on how far you push it out of its milieu. When you push it out of its milieu, you destroy what it is. But you've got stuff, and you gave me a very interesting idea, which I'm developing. He said, what? I'm doing Traviata. You are? Yes. And he, you know, he was very excited about that. So we developed Traviata as a play, based on the, the original Dumas. And I introduced into it just very natural behavior. And I realized also that this is a part that required literally 4 different kinds of voices. And I had to find ways, since Pat did not have a very big voice, but a very true voice. But her sense of character was so inimitable, and working with her. And of course, we took pauses, and there were altercations, and no, you can't do that. What? The conductor said, you're going to have a pantomime during the third act? Never! That's my music. It went on and on that way. So that finally, the moment came, of course, with that now has become sort of a tradition. The long pause in the first act before she sings Estrano. And Pat was marvelous, because she acted the whole thing out after the party had gone, and she was suddenly not the fancy hostess, but she was a very sick girl who was trying to recover, getting warm by the fire, sitting down and pulling herself together. She did all that before she said Estrano. And I remember on opening night, Julius, and you can check that with him when you speak to him, I think, was sitting next to me in the observer's room when the moment came, and she started to be silent. And I noticed what happened, but the conductor, he turned sideways, like, you know, I'm going to have to tolerate this. He hated it. He hated that pause. And Julius said, everybody's very quiet. And then she finished. It works, he said. I said, I think so. And the audience ate it up. And other things that were, were characterful, that made Violetta a real woman rather than an opera singer. Oh, well, that's one of my favorite moments, only in terms of visual response from the audience. I was seated at a performance of it, and I was aware that there were 3 nuns in the orchestra seated around the 8th row, you know, on the aisle. And when the moment came, I kept my eye on them. When she threw the crucifix, one of the little wimples, and I'm not kidding, from behind went. I saw the nodding head. She knew what I meant. And I said, you see, someone should have taken a picture of that. But and on with things like that, you know, that really reflected an aspect of the character that was not indicated. and it was filling in their lives that made what it was that I did of special value and ultimately have some kind of significance in the nature of what it was that one did in a new opera that made it relative. It had nothing to do with politics or whatever. It was relative to human behavior. And that was the thing that made the difference. Oh, but then, of course, I must take Patinate back and give him a little shake for wherever he is. After the success of Traviata, he could have made a whole Italian dinner for me. He loved it. He then worked on Madame Butterfly. By the way, he conducted both Traviata and Butterfly beautifully in ways that I've never heard it. He had more pauses to give me when we did Madame Butterflies than I can use. But he loved it. But he sort of suddenly got the idea. Well, the idea of Madame Butterfly wearing modern clothes. I saw it in a magazine. There was a picture of a I'll never forget that picture. Saturday Evening Post, mind you. I turned it, and I just was startled by when I was looking at it. There was this Japanese lady in complete kimono, seated at a sewing machine, and doing an American dress. I said, is this for her or for whom? Then I said, well, of course it might be for her. If it were Madame Butterfly, who was becoming an American wife, she would want to try to wear American clothes. So from then on, the logic took over. Second act, she is wearing American clothes, trying to live in his image of what an American wife should be. So all the details that came from that basic idea, even the way she moved in her modern dress, slightly was still the geisha, but it was something she had worked on. The furniture in the house had been turned into modern furniture. And it added also to the amusement and sweetness and ingenuousness of it. And part of it, of course, was the fact that she had to cut her hair short. As a modern woman, the American women at that time wore either Gibson hairdos, as the wife later who comes in. So the hair had been cut, and yet she kept it as a souvenir. And of course, when she's betrayed and realizes that she must leave the Japanese, the American, the false American image, and she goes back to using her kimono, which she refused to go back to earlier in meeting Pinkerton. She wanted to meet him in the famous, night vigil as an American wife. So then that was all over with. She covered her American dress with the old kimono, and among other things, by that time, I think she was so hysterical, and she went to seek the knife, and there was the hair. And if only I can go back, if I can now really become that woman again. And that was the effort to get the hair back, and it just didn't work. And by that time, she had pretty well lost it. So that moment was poignant because of the whole history of that she was going through. Without that history, the attempt to be an American wife, that moment would not have its significance or its poignancy. It was very interesting how that came about. I mean, I'd always been interested in film. I had experiences out in Hollywood, which I would never go back to Hollywood. I mean, there everything was automatic, and even now the idea of my even doing a film does not entice me. I'm always in admiration for people who do direct, particularly really fine directors. But I didn't want to go back to do it. But I loved film, and I thought film had an integral part on the stage in some way, amalgamating the two. And I remember that Julius came to me, and I really stole the production of Pelléas and Mélisande. he was again going to ask another director. I said, I want to do that. He said, what? You want to do Pelléas? I want to do Pelléas. But that's not your type. What do you mean it's not my type of opera? It certainly is. Bring reality to that opera and then give a soft covering to it, and you'll get what you want out of it. So he was caught up, he loved what I've been doing, so he gave me that. I started to try to do film to it. And I realized when I attempted to do it, I did a few interludes. I realized that the rhythm of film was really connected with a more modern kind of life. In other words, depicting it on stage. And I said, no, I won't do it with film. But I did a very good production. As a matter of fact, it's one of my favorite productions. But right after that, he came to me with an idea of doing a Janacek opera, and that was Jenůfa. And I had, meanwhile, gotten to love Janacek's music, and I read about the Macropolis case, which I knew the play, and I had seen the play, and I thought it was fascinating. And I heard the opera. I said, oh, it's terrific. This is an opera that has the possibilities. And when I read his notes, Janacek's notes, he said, there must be lots of long shadows on the stage. So I said, oh, he's talking about... And I realized that it was automatically right for the opera, because most of the opera, and this is why, by the way, it never got played, most of the opera took place years and years and years ago. So the entire opera is merely a retelling of what happened to bring it to this moment. So I realized that that was the central idea of the film, to capture her many lives, the lives of a woman who had lived for 365 years and who appeared in many characters. I had seen a wonderful ballet at the Old New York City Opera by Emile Ardolino and Gardner Compton. It became a very fashionable and wonderful piece of work done for the Joffrey Company. And I immediately sought them out, and I sat them down and I played them the opera, and they said, what are we going to do with that? So I said, well, I'll give you some ideas. I just spoke for 5 minutes and they were crawling the walls. And that was the first opera in which I introduced the idea that film was the subtext of this opera. As a result of that, this opera entered the repertoire. It was the first Janacek opera that entered the repertoire because the audience suddenly was impacted by the story and the visual elements, most of which were shot in New York. Well, I did Totestadt, and it sort of led, by the way, the Macropolis led to a conclusion that I had about the nature of film and opera. And that is that there are many operas that the curtain is either down when much glorious music is being played and nothing is happening, but that there are certain operas that need extensions beyond lumber and canvas before they can take life. One, of course, was the Macropolis. Then, of course, also the Totestadt, which when you saw the original productions, they were clumsy, lumber and canvas. How to create this magical world of fantasy. And the Village Romeo and Juliet of Delius, whom I adored, and I did several media productions of his. Most of the time in the Village Romeo and Juliet, as I said, the curtain was down when great music was playing, like the Walk to the Paradise Gardens. Suddenly, in film, you saw what that was. And by seeing the young lovers walking through this garden for 8 minutes of music, that was otherwise just orchestra, one got a sense of how they got together. And throughout the visualization of elements that would have been and had been rather awkward with lumber and canvas, suddenly took on great life. And that opera was seen by Julius in Washington and then brought to New York and shown elsewhere. I've done many media productions. There's one particularly I'm very proud of the En l'enfant et les sortilèges of Ravel, which I did at Glyndebourne by imposing on it something that I had read about it when it was originally written by Ravel. He finished it and he thought the only person that could realize it was Walt Disney. And he played it for Walt Disney, and the response, I don't remember the exact words, was that it was great, but it was just too special. So it never got its life, and we brought its life between its magical physical realization of Maurice Sendak and Ronald Chase, and we created the visual animation world that turns on the child. So that you didn't have a bunch of silly people running around in gray costumes, or rather in green costumes, being this frog or that. You saw numbers jumping, you saw the fire really appear, and we kept in mind the early animation of Méliès, you know, the guy who did the first film about traveling to the moon, which were early animation, and we kept that style. And in fact, I'm very happy to know that it's just been re-released on the Glyndebourne production on a DVD, and it really shows it. Now, I hear that the New York City Opera is contemplating doing that coming up, and also the Cunning Vixen of Janacek, which is just a great stunner. I also discovered during the course of all this, you know, the old adage about, well, you know, it makes no difference what you do to an opera. It's the music that wins. That's only partly true. I've seen too many productions wrecked by irresponsible kinds of productions in terms of seeking relevance, that wide open world, you know, word that could permit you to savage a piece while in the supposedly in the illusion that you are giving it a sense of life. I'd always have loved Maurice's work. You know, there were books for children, but you know, I'm a child too, like a number of things. I used to buy all his books, and I loved them. And I said, this man should be involved in the theater. So I called him up one day, got his number. I said, hello, Mr. Sendak, this is Frank Corsaro. I don't know whether you know who I am, but I know who you are. So he said, oh, I know who you are, and blah, blah, blah. We were talking, and I said, well, have you ever thought of really working for the theater? Why don't we meet and we'll talk? Well, in 2 minutes, we were pals, etc. He said, what have you got in mind for me? I said, well, I think two operas that I would love to see us both do. One is The Magic Flute, and the other is The Cunning Vixen. He said, I adore those two operas. Mozart, to him, is, you know, I mean, there is no one like Mozart. In fact, he owns one of those treasured letters of Mozart that when he brings it out, you just, you know, that kind of thing. But oddly enough, I received a commission from David Gockley in Houston. Would I do a new Magic Flute? I said, ha. I will do it. I said, only on one condition, and that is that I have Maurice Sendak design it. And he said, who? You know, not everybody gets children's books at 40, whatever it was. And I told him who he was. Oh, well, okay, listen, talk to him. So I talked to him. We worked out a set of designs, and they were so imaginative and so wonderful. So I invited Gockley. He came here. He was seated there, and Maurice met him. And I'll never forget David, who's, you know, one of the better impresarios and has become one of the great gung-ho masters of the art of turned to Maurice and said, "You know, Mr. Sendak, even in all seriousness, writing a children's book is not exactly like doing an opera." So I said, "Oh," but anyway, it started, and the production was gorgeous. It never came to New York because it was too big for the New York City Opera. It was done for Houston. It appeared many, many places, and recently had been revived, and it was destroyed during a hurricane in Houston, and it just simply torn apart, and it could not be brought together again. But then up came the Cunning Vixen. I mean, it was like almost like, someone was reading my mind. And again, Maurice and I put it together, and some of it is so gorgeous. It's unbelievable to see it, how he imagined it. And I see various productions of it, and they never... See, by the way, that's one opera they turn into sort of the modern follies, all the animals are right out of some, swank club somewhere, and it remains to me one of the great operas of the 20th century. In fact, I think between Janacek and Puccini, you have the two greatest opera composers of the 20th century as far as I'm concerned, and I would love to do more. But anyway, so that's how I met Maurice Sendak, and we have now done something like 10 or 11 productions. Some of them, two of them based on his book, Where the Wild Things Are, and Higgledy Piggledy Pop with music by Oliver Knussen. We did the Cunning Vixen, as I mentioned, the L'Enfant et les Sortilèges, and L'Heure Espagnole of Ravel, which was one of the sauciest pieces of visualizations I've ever seen. And we tried to do several other more sententious works, such as Idomeneo, and we had a semi-flop with it because it didn't quite suit his style, and yet at the same time he was reaching for his own. But that, now I'm trying to lure Maurice back, but I don't know whether I will be successful. Not at all. I just took it as a matter of course. But some of those awful paws of the people and gropings, I still had the original image of the first opera I ever saw about lovemaking. I mean, the first opera that I ever saw, which was partly about two lovers. That was an opera of the Salmaggi Opera Company in Brooklyn. And it was like a production right out of a comedy. And these two lovers who, one had a paunch that he could not quite manage, she couldn't quite, it was that kind of thing, and I just laughed. So I just simply did what I thought was quite natural, and was naturally the necessity of what lovemaking or whatever it is that is required in terms of action, how it resembled reality, which is, by the way, I don't think composers write unrealistic operas. Even the operas that are, have a particular style. Style itself means how people live. So that that's why when, for instance, I did Péléas, and the son of the wonderful French tenor Jobin was playing Péléas, and he came from France to see it. And he said, "May I speak to you afterwards?" And he saw it. I spoke to him. He said, "What in heaven's name did you do to this piece? We go to the theater to see it, and as if we're going to church. And this thing was so vibrant, I couldn't believe it was Péléas." I said, "Well, I approached it totally realistically. I brought out all the conflicts, all that had to be done, and then I put a dampener on it. I only would allow certain things to go so far. And that, with the scrim down to give it a sense of long ago and far away, gave us the sense of a long fuse burning somewhere, but a fuse burning. So he put his hand to his head. He said, I don't understand, but I understand. I remember. It was a very touching moment. But no, I did not. Even Rudell wrote it. He said, Frank Corsaro did not invent sex. He wrote that in the forward to Maverick. Not all of them. One girl I remember with Traviata just wouldn't throw the rosaries on the floor. She just couldn't. Her own problems got in the way. Sometimes I had to send wives of baritones and tenors who attended rehearsals home so that they wouldn't interfere. One wife appeared on an opening night of Pagliacci, and her husband, who had really given himself to the love scene with Pat Brooks, and it was fantastic. And opening night, it went flat. And I couldn't understand it. I went backstage, and then I saw his wife come in. And I immediately knew why and what had happened. So I said, may I speak to you? And I went out in the hall with her. I said, would you do me a favor? And she said, yes, sure. I'm making an assumption. I think the reason that your husband did not do what I wanted tonight was that you were there. He became self-conscious of what he was doing. Would you do me a favor and not come to the performances that he... She looked at me at first that I would be insulting her. And then she said, no, I understand. And she didn't come, and he went back. I had several cases like that. I had another one in Europe with the wife of the man in the La Fanciulla del West, and I had to tell her on the stage, Signora, va! And her husband was standing there, and I said, I don't want you in this theater. You are telling him what to do. I am telling him what to do. Who makes the macaroni? You do. So he'll listen to you, and I'd rather he listen to me. So leave, please. And he looked at me beaming. And she insulted and left, you know. And from then on, it was all right. So anyway, things like that happen. If the work moves me in some way, if I get a sense of human experience, if I get a sense more than even a human experience, if I get a sense of a kind of a spiritual insight of kind, if it does that for me, that it means that there's something that I can contribute because I feel strongly about such matters. That is always the criterion for me about a piece. I won't take something that I have no connection with. When I first went into opera, I came across a kind of axiom in which opera singers never cared about acting, but all actors wanted to sing. Good actors. So I said, what is going on here? How do I convince the singers about acting? And for me, call it the greatest challenge, and perhaps for me also, the fact that I had a company and I had a willingness, since the ideas that I established early on in productions were catching on, of developing the level of reality, which people, by the way, like Max Reinhardt, David Belasco, and several other very prominent figures in history who attempted to get into opera. Stanislavski, by the way, wrote one of the great books about opera, in which he was commissioned by his own government to work with the big opera company at the time, in the Bolshoi, and with young people in it, to develop so-called method opera. And he did. I even tried to imitate one case of Onegin when I was out in Hawaii, and I realized it was impossible because I could do the outline of it, but it required more. So for me, making opera a living theater that it was a play with music, that each thing had a separate reality in a way that the theater couldn't have. The theater couldn't do duets or trios. The opera could, and you'd get the sense. The orchestra had a life of its own. It was making comments with what was going on or against it. So it was a much more complex kind of reality for me. So I began to prefer more and more doing opera than I did theater. I did less and less theater, and I now hardly ever go to the theater because there's not even a remnant of the kind of work that was available at a certain time when the Actor Studio and methods of that kind were very much in the air and people were fascinated, and acting was really a special craft. So I have preferred to continue that work in opera, and to this day I get the kind of response that always amazes me and fascinates me and excites me. For me, for instance, in modern times, seeing Renee Fleming do Traviata, something that I had done once before with a wonderful lady, but seeing it realized again in equally, if not more superlative terms, to me was one of the best theatrical experiences I've ever had. And to see that it occurred not too long ago, and other people are available and eager even to do that. I just find that somehow the times are not with that kind of work now, and that bothers me. But the time is not with many, many things in our lives. And so those values are now either being questioned or dismissed or just overlooked, that's all. And I hope that because basically they are human, and that perhaps humanity might come back, you know. I think so. For instance, I sometimes see singers who develop vocal problems. And I recognize that very often that the vocal problem is not a vocal problem, it's an acting problem. They don't know how to do certain things, so they overload the voice to do it. And results, assists, this and that. Yes, they want to. I think they long for it. There is a vision of it amongst them. But at the same time, it is not being encouraged. Not in the way that I was encouraged at the time at the New York City Opera with Julius, who understood what I was doing, even if I ran into trouble with him. Don Giovanni was a case in point. But there are people who have taken over opera houses and taken positions as directors, etc., who I really don't think are connected with this kind of work and the nature of the process involved in evolving a performance. And I pity that. I'm sorry that that's happening. And I see the result going to scenery, to effects, and all of which I think throw, the emphasis often to the wrong place to such a degree that, for instance, I felt for a long time about the period of time that we've been just discussing, when opera was beginning to really gain an impetus in bringing audiences in, and audiences were fascinated with what they were seeing. Rather than continue that work, somehow it got lopped. And I don't know exactly the moment in time when it did, but it's staggering now. And I would have loved to have seen that the humanization, let me put it that way, the humanization through theatrical reality. Now that may sound like an opposite idea, but it's not. Theatrical reality is really a kind of intense human expression. Otherwise it loses its effect and only becomes decorous, decoration. And so that's where at the moment I look at the opera scene and I wonder what's next. I was, I think, probably the first one to do that, which is to incorporate singers into acting classes. And in doing that, I've still remember many wonderful people that I still see today who made careers and whose voices, blossomed, and they somehow got a kind of level of insight about themselves as artists that was not just the question of singing, but as I said, of the possibility that what they experienced and understood about a piece of music written 100 years before, that it was that input that the audience wanted to see, that is what theater is about. What will this person bring us this night that I have not seen and that I've paid $100 to come to see? Give me back a piece of my life, as they're asking for. And in teaching and in developing artists, young artists, both in my own private sessions and later for many years at the Juilliard and in some part at the Actors Studio, we had some singers there. I have kept on, and in master classes that I give, to make clear that a process exists, a technique beyond a vocal technique that must be incorporated with that. Because in its own way, when the person, the actor, speaks fully, he is singing. And the singer, when he is singing and or she is singing and allows herself to express her sense of what it's about, she is speaking. The thing that I always go after, for instance, a master class would be a very good example of what I'm talking about. You would have a group of young singers come out and they bring out, and I usually ask them, bring me 2 or 3 songs that you particularly personally love, for whatever reason. Song, popular, aria, leader, anything, but give me 3. And when they come out and sing, and whatever questioning I propose, the answer always is, what is it about this particular song that you love? Well, if they can either give an answer, then I say, all right, take the song. What is the rock bottom reality about this music that you have to understand before you can even open your mouth? And they think about it. And of course, they will answer from their heart because this is why they love it. I said, well, when the answer comes, okay, what do you know about that? Me? Yes, you. What do you know about it? And when they make that connection, it's staggering. It's like seeing a person change right in front of you. So the teaching is that effort to reach that essence of understanding. And it's also, by the way, one of the reasons that this kind of work has an inbuilt problem in it when it remains either isolated or not part of a company, because it emerged from people who worked and loved and acted together. It was a kind of spiritual exercise in order to explore the reality, the given realities of any given piece. Somehow that element, call it whatever, spirituality or what, either doesn't seem to have enough cachet today. Yeah, that was one of the things I was so taken by the fact that when the award from the National Endowment came my way, that it was as director librettist. Well, that I was really taken with. I've written not too many librettos, but there have been Well, you know, I've worked, by the way, with modern composers very much as if I was also a writer helping them. And there have been recently Eloise and Abelard that I did for Stephen Paulus, which was done at Juilliard, and a one-act opera for Passetteri, also called Before Breakfast, after a Eugene O'Neill play, which was given attention by the endowment at the time, and an opera called Frau Margot, which was premiered in Fort Worth about 2 years ago and will be revived in 2011, based on an original play I wrote about Alban Berg. And I have now written one that I treasure very much, based on the writings of Henry James, called Corridors, that I'm hoping, particularly in these embattled recessional times, might lift some portcullis somewhere. I have a couple of projects up my sleeve that I want to continue, and all of this comes from, you know, just my love of the form, my background as a writer. I write novels and several books, an autobiography called Maverick, so that the librettist aspect of this is also something that I adore, because it allows me then to direct it. And I know what it is that it needs. And it allows me to help continue doing some of the work in multimedia that I think has gone by the wayside or has become just simply facile signs and backdrops, and not as yet continued the possibility of it being a very live, substantive part of an opera. And so as I write these libretti, I keep thinking about the nature of the mingling of these forms. And I know it's a tough time to think about it, but you know, it's a tough time for anything. So that there must be ways, even during these tough times, to see where values lie and to see how it can be accomplished. You know, otherwise we wake up every morning to a large celestial chorus of no, and then that's impossible. So I will go on. I've written also another libretto called Bliss, about the God genome, an experiment that was tried by a group called the Holotropic, in seeking the essence of God in the in private regression, and they did some remarkable work. And then the leading people involved were killed or died in a very strange way, and it was dropped. But I wrote a libretto which is in the works. I mean, finished, and it's being put to music. The question also is finding the composer who's on your wavelength. I mean, a man like Carlisle Floyd doesn't come around so easily, time and again. But he writes his own, and he directs his own. I worked with him on Mice and Men, and I love working with him, and I was also responsible for its shape. I threw out one whole scene 2 nights before they were going, and he nearly died. And I said, Carlisle, think about it. Go into the bathroom. He went into my bathroom here, and he came out and said, you know, that means we have to call right away and cut them from rehearsing. And I said, call them. Do you agree? Yes. And so we called, and poor lady, she was out of work. And the set, which was about a whorehouse, which was, he thought, would add to it, didn't mean much for the opera, and it didn't. So I was happy that I was able to help that way. And he and I are very friendly and very close, and we talk about libretti and books and things. And he's remarkable. Stephen Paulus is another remarkable composer. Protein, wonderful sense of poetry and drama. His opera, Eloise and Abelard, needs to be seen again after the first performance. And I am trusting that he is now ready to bite his tongue about the music that's coming out of him reading Corridors, which is based on 2 short stories of Henry James, but also things in his life. So that for me has been interesting because it amalgamates my own reaction to literature and finds theatrical form for it. It's one of the saddest things in history that Henry James, who loved the theater, who wrote infinite numbers of plays, 2 volumes of plays, every one was a flop. He didn't quite understand what one did or didn't do, you know. And yet years later, his works have become absolutely protein. I mean, you know, there are more composers who have put his works to music and writers to plays. And Edith Wharton wanted to have an opera written. And she didn't, based on one of her stories, she didn't know how to go about it. She gave it to the wrong person. And it's always fascinating to see the interlocking of these things and how much literature there is really that is rich, and that opera carries 10 steps further from the original intent and makes it a really special new experience. So I'm all for that, you know, and that's what I'm resting on. Well, you know, since it all happened here, I am an American artist. But I sometimes feel very much that I've had a very strange feeling, maybe as I get older, that I've lived more lives than I can account for. You know, I really have. I really feel that. It's a very strange thing. There's a painting of me back there done by an artist who I looked at. I said, but that looks like I'm Egyptian. And, you know, I think I lived at that time, too. I lived many times. And now I'm an American. So to just simply say artist is to leave out the fact that it all happened, that which we're talking about, in this country. And it is of an essence. And actually, if it is to continue, it will be in this country. I've done work abroad, but it's all emanated from America. At that time, I was the head of the Houston Grand Opera School. He was the first, I think, to start having a school for singers. Many of them are still singing today. Many are not. But out of that also, I began to discover new works to try. And indeed, he was very willing to let that happen. And among the ones that I discovered was Rinaldo by Handel, which when I heard, I said, my, what a fabulous piece this is. And so, and I immediately thought of Jackie Horn, because there's no one else who could play that part. And I've seen other people try. Anyway, I approached her about it, and by God, yes, she was willing. And so we tried it in Houston, and it was quite a wonderful success. And we then went on with it, and I made a discovery about it, and that is that I always wondered how those old productions with their, you know, cut-out scenery worked. And I read that at the time when Handel wrote his operas, and other composers like I wrote their operas, when they were finished, they were sent or given to a particular architectural house. So that, in other words, the great artist Bernini was one of those who had that. So it would be Bernini's, whatever he called himself, presents Handel's so-and-so. Why is that? Because, well, these people created these fantastic visual effects that are part and parcel of what these operas require. I never forget reading that in a Bernini production, you know, those cutouts and various layers, that a storm started in the backstage, and waves started coming through the various alleys, down, raising waves came forward toward the audience, and just as the wave was supposed to fall into the audience, up came huge stones from the ground and held the water back, and ladies fainted. I said, my God, we can't even do that today, never mind. So I said we have to find somebody who can do that for us for Ronaldo, because Ronaldo's full of magic and things like that. Well, I found the guy. Oh my God! I said, where have you been? Well, God, I've forgotten what he said, but he listened, and he offered ideas, and I was in seventh heaven. Oh, you could do this, could do that, and then he said, but there's only one problem. I said, oh, here it comes. Where are you doing this? I said, well, we're going to do it in Ottawa. And then we are supposedly going to the Metropolitan Opera. By that time, we knew that. Well, if you do it in Ottawa, that will be one occasion. But if you go to the Metropolitan, it will have to be redone completely. I said, oh. And of course, given the finances and all of that, it was impossible. So that was why those men had their particular ateliers, because they owned the way they could do it. And if you wanted what they wanted, you went to them, or you went to this one, or you went to that one. So then the question of finding the right combination to make this Baroque marvel come to life was tricky. I found a very interesting designer in England who did a wonderful job, but it still didn't do the kind of thing that I had visualized originally. I kept thinking, would I have done this with film? No, because film is wrong for that kind of opera. The rhythm of that music doesn't go with the nervous sense of film. So all I had then was a rather remarkable combination. I had Marilyn Horne, who was so extraordinary in the part. She was it. And on top of that, I'd made a discovery that was which made, in other words, it added something to the production and to the idea of what Handel is about in the theater. When I go to the theater now, I hate going to see Handel operas. I'll tell you why. They're always the mincy ballet, for the war. I mean, men dancing, whatever, or whatever. I found an Olympic team of guys who we created a battle scene, which was a very important scene, final scene in the opera, with Marilyn Horne suspended in the air on a plank from an old war engine of the period, while these guys threw themselves against one another, killed each other. I mean, it was mind-blowing. It was, in a sense, it had two hits of the evening. One was Marilyn, and the other one these guys. And what it did, in its own way, it created what I was discussing about the effects of drama created by the scenery and the other elements. This was as vivid, as remarkable as Bernini's Waves. And it had never been seen in a Baroque opera, and it has not been seen since. The last time I saw Ronaldo, they were going around doing this. And by the way, all Handel's operas now, you will excuse me, but I've been Handelized to death. I love Handel, but he wrote an opera every year. And therefore, it was the year of that opera. And the house presented it. And then he would go the next year, or then he would skip it. And he went on until finally he lost it, and he didn't have his Italian singers anymore, and he went and sought out the Lord and wrote another opera called The Messiah. But the question was that now you turn the corner, you get cornflake boxes full of Handel. I mean, there are more Handel revivals than you can see straight. In fact, it only to show how much he stole from himself all the time and how he recycled himself. So it has become, again, my feeling is if any of these productions were given the values that we're talking about, boy, they'd be big hits. they would be smashing hits. The opera emanated from Houston, went to Ottawa, and it was then offered by the Canadian government to the Metropolitan as a particular gift from them to the opera. And it turned out to be the first Handel opera that was premiered. Actually, it's amazing. At the Metropolitan. I didn't make them, and of course, with Marilyn playing one of her signature roles, and the fact that we had this great baritone, Sam Raimi, making his debut, which was a smasher. So it was a marvelous evening of theater, and I did some marvelous effects in it that had to do with the magical world of fantasy. But you know, what's interesting is looking back in terms of history, in the original production of Rinaldo at Covent Garden, there is a scene where Almirena, the lady that is in love and that Rinaldo loves, are in a magic garden full of birds singing in their cages. And it's an exquisite scene which we used in a various way. But at the original production, these birds were, and mind you, somebody must have been imaginative, or whatever the production was that was of its time, were let loose. And they flew around the theater and finally ended up in the rafters and beyond. And of course, what happened, by the end of the opera, the birds were really letting them have it from above. And the theater was closed for about 2 weeks because it took them that long to get all the birds out of the rafters. So much for realism. Well, you know, I don't think I could have accomplished, say, let's put it that way since we've been talking about me, accomplished any of these things, primarily all of the earlier things, without Julius. He was the one who brought me to the New York City Opera, and he was the one who encouraged, when he saw what it was we were doing and how he would go along. And in fact, he was probably the most adventuresome impresario I've ever come across, with a sense of what the music was about and what the dramatic vitality of would be added to his company by introducing all of these elements fused in productions of either the old and new operas. He presented many more new operas, like the Macropolis Case, etc., than anyone that I know. So that we had our, you know, every little tips, John Giovanni, but that was a problem we all had not quite assimilated. It was very simple, and both of us didn't realize it, was that he was trying to do 2 productions of Don Giovanni at once, one in English and one in Italian, and that the English also cross-pollinating the singers. But to my horror and his, discovered that when you went to the English, it had different meanings from what it was in the Italian. So we never had time to put it together properly. So the curtain went up on an unfinished production, and when I still remember it, my God, the ugly ending. But nevertheless, Julius promoted that kind of work, went on and on, was also responsible for people like Pat Brooks, and continuing, I wish he had allowed her to do more, with Beverly Sills' emergence and Norman Treigle and people like that. He created very singular kinds of artists that are not really been matched. We hear about foreign this and Russian that and this one, but they had a kind of ingrained community that one imagines the Russians had in the Bolshoi, and that it was really a company. They all essentially were Americans, and he doted on it, and he promoted their vitalities, their energies, and served them with materials that we could really feed on and enjoy and create special theater with. I know of no other impresario, because most impresarios or opera companies either have their own local situation, or if they're international, they have to rely on calling this artist from England, this one from Russia, this one from Serbia, lift a rock in Estonia and find a bass. You know what I mean? That kind of thing. And it's very tricky to try to amalgamate all that into something, sumptuous. And a lot of these companies are not very willing to exchange productions. They want their own. So instead they import, foreign productions very often, and some of them are quite good, but they don't have the cohesive quality and the kind of sense of awakening, developing, nurturing, and evolving a working company of artists, the way Julius had with the New York City Opera. When I first approached Marilyn, I thought, well, she's a real one of these. She was she my first diva? Well, she was sort of, big. I always usually kind of avoided those kind of people because, you have to fight all of the shticks of being a diva. You have to buy them, too. But she didn't have any of those. I mean, she had a sense of herself. I love the fact that her voice was so vibrant and alive. I told her once, your voice is based on primal aggression. You have a primal anger in your voice. It never stops. And it is so exciting, it's unbelievable. And at the same time, she never lost sight of what was happening humanly on the stage. And she always lent herself emotionally to when the music required her to be inner, and she had a vocal technique that never stopped. So she was one of those rare phenomenons that, even more phenomenal because it was in such specialized material, like a Handel opera, a Baroque opera, never mind a realistic opera, but a Baroque opera. So I said, remember, I once told her, I said, if you can do this in this opera, are there any other people that sing these kind of operas that can even match that? The only one I saw heard was Lorraine Hunt Lieberson in Xerxes. She astounded me. She had the same thing that I saw in Marilyn. I said, well, now there are two. Unfortunately, now there are only one. The poor lady passed away. But she was simply, Marilyn was not, I always think of Marilyn, she's just a great singer who happens to also sing Handel. and therefore, I recently called her up. I was listening to Ronaldo, and I hadn't seen Marilyn for a long time, but I found her, and I just told her, and I reminisced with her, and I could hear her, remember. And it was one of the sweetest moments I've had for quite some time. And when you ask her, please, she'll tell you about my little conversation where I said, you are one of your own. You will always remain that in my memory and in the memories of the others. Ronaldo, in my mind, is one of the great moments that I've experienced in opera theater. I would say, as many as 15 people worked with me. Some of them just simply didn't make it. Some of them went off to other areas of work. One of them was Robin Thompson, who became involved in the more executive end of the New York City Opera. But several others, as I say, have passed away and who had careers. and developed them for a while. But unfortunately, it's a tricky process. It's trickier than working with an actor because the director depends on the actor, you know. And very often I found when I was working at the Actor Studio with directors who brought people in from wherever they could get to do things, that I would spend a session breaking down each problem individually of the actor and then deal with the director's problem, which meant that there were problems in how you incorporate and involve. And that means finding a way of working that we're all beamed in on, and therefore is a working, automatic working process on any given production. So I wish I could do more of that work, but I don't think there's any provision for it. Essentially, the exercises are the exercises that I would give to any actor. I mean, the exercises are all ways for the actor to be able to be in touch with the private sense of private experience and be able to talk about it, evolve it, either consciously or unconsciously, but able to use the emotional reactions from it to explore it within the confines of the given words of a play or the given texts. For instance, I mean, I think, for instance, the most extraordinary example that I can give you in opera was the one with Renee Fleming in Traviata, and that is that we went through emotional reactions during the course of it. And I remember she said to me finally, how am I going to do all this? It's like, you know, one thing after another comes at me. I said, well, I'll tell you what I think we ought to do. I said, what? I said, we're going to make Violetta have a few drinks. I said, yes, you know, she's at a party, she's been drinking. I said, well, what good will that do? I said, if you will really believe that you've been drinking, what is your favorite drink? And she told me. I said, all right, let's first do this exercise, but I'll tell you what it's about. If you can believe that you've had a number of these drinks at the party, and that you can feel it in your senses and your body, it will take care of everything else. She said, what? It will open up every emotional element that you have already worked for by itself without you having to say, ding one, ding two. So I remember that we would start with the exercise, and there's a specific exercise that you do. You want to hear it? No. Well, it's a long exercise. Well, basically what it was is you take a glass of water, you drink it, you look at it. What does it taste like? Not much taste. What are you drinking? And then she would tell me what she was drinking, the wine she had or the drink. I said, well, what's the difference in the color? Can you see the color difference? Yes. All right. Can you smell it? Yes. First, I smell water. Yes, of course. Now you smell the water. Now smell it as if it were that drink. What would be the difference? And then she'd tell me what the difference was. And where do you feel it? Well, I feel it, she would tell me up here, and then she'd back of my throat. And then it would go on from there. Then it would come to taste. First taste. And where do you feel it? Oh, it's warm. And on until she really believed that she had been drinking. I said, finally, how many of these have you had? I remember the first time she said, 3. At that moment. Where would you feel the effects of 3 of these? How different is the 3rd drink? She explained it, how it warmed her in a very way, what it did to her arms. I said, okay, every evening when we start, you're going to take a glass of water and just look at it and tell yourself what it is. And then just tell yourself how many of these you've had as Violetta when she steps on stage. And I am not kidding. She never told. I said, don't tell anyone. This is for yourself. And after the performance of the first act, we would see one another, and I would say, 3 drinks, yes. Other times I'd say, 1. Why? Well, I didn't feel so. Oh, all right. That's what we did for the first act. The others were more emotional. They just appealed to her. I mean, did you ever feel this way about, and it would lead her to musical phrasing that was, it just came, no one could tell her to do that. It came from the fact that it was an expression of that inner thing. One size does not fit all. No, absolutely. See, with Renee, the sensory feeling was the important thing. And that opened up everything. And I have never heard that last act ever sung like that before by anyone, including Claudia Muzio on that record. And speaking of that letter, they can be utilized as part of singing. In other words, in my mind, for instance, there was a recent program in an effort at the Juilliard to go out, send mentors out to various schools for young instrumentalists, because this also goes for instrumentalists. I've worked with instrumentalists and gotten equally dramatic effects. But sometimes if they're not either in other words, these people could sing. When the instrumentalist can't quite, then you have to learn how to, or in the process of teaching a singer how to sing and not just put emphasis on the glottis or this or that, you incorporate the sense of feeling or what it is they feel like in the problem area. And they begin to respect that it's their voices are not isolated from the rest of them. Unfortunately, a good many teachers isolate the voice from the rest of their being. And the result shows later on. So these techniques are very, very valuable. There are I think, and I want to talk about this maybe later on, but there are ultimately spiritual elements involved with this work. It evolves into areas that are, let's put non-commercial. Because, the singer, the actor goes out and uses this to make money, etc., etc. But it also opens up people to areas of their being which have to do with other practices, with other processes, with other involvements. And it can also, for them, look like a danger. And they sometimes avoid, and they sometimes clamp down on it. And I think part of what's happening today is a subtle and unconscious recognition of what it is that we need, which has to do with that part of ourselves that, is the least evolved, greed being the greatest coloration that we know, And I also think that's part of the reason why this kind of work has been left behind. It's only again when we sort of reorganize ourselves and can believe that sometimes a company presenting Chekhov is as important or more important than who's in it. Because we only take who's in it. We only will revive Chekhov to see who's in it, not to see Chekhov. Put a Chekhov revival on Broadway without any name in it, good luck. It won't last a week. That's part of the bloodthirsty element of the beast known as the audience. And yet the audience feeds on this when they see it. When they see this happening on stage for the singer or an actor, they are transported. They are really, they see themselves vindicated. Some of their own Mishigas gets evolved. I'm not kidding. At that moment, we know that experience. We see something, it moves us, and my God, suddenly we want to be whatever it is that we hope we could be for a moment. So that's why people have always said, why the prices are so, big? Yes, because they charge that much to be able to see, be given that experience. And unfortunately, it's gotten out of hand. So now you have to, you're practically next to a foreclosure if you go out to a night on the theater.